and the same from me as well. It's so nice to have someone in Queensland talking about these things with me. Indulge me. Yeah, I'll start with a bit of background. This is a paper that's coming out in a book with Lewis on cosmopolitan institutions. I am flattered that Lewis has invited me here, and I've found it very rewarding to be asked to engage with this topic for the first time, because I've spent most of my lecture classes on international and global ethics and on cosmopolitan moral and political theory, and I always begin with cosmopolitanism does not mean a world state. So, but I never engage with it much more than that. So this has been good for me to have to actually think this through, what my issues are with it. The paper I'm presenting today is an attempt to think through cosmopolitanism in the context of a non-cosmopolitan world. Now, I'm using cosmopolitanism in the moral, normative sense. I have a minimal idea of cosmopolitanism. My minimal idea of cosmopolitanism could be interpreted as simply the sense that human beings everywhere have equal, or should be treated as having equal moral standing. Another way of putting that is, there's no prima facie reason for ruling out any individual human being from the realm of moral consideration. What we owe moral duties, whether that be we owe them respect for their basic rights, or whether we owe them humanitarian aid, or whether we need to think of them as being owed moral consideration in a way we might not think about animals or plants, even though we can make a case for those as well. And that sounds a very simple idea, but it's actually quite penetrating if we look at the ways in which the world is not structured to recognise that. So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we all know most of the time most states are not particularly interested in the effects of their actions upon outsiders. If they are, it's for largely pragmatic reasons. We want to get what we want, we need to take you into account. But the nation state, as we understand it, has been constituted as, in the realm of the social contract, thought as an exclusive club. We owe special duties to each other by virtue of being a member of this club, in this case Australia. And the things that we owe to each other primarily derive from our membership in that club. So if I owe you standing, it's because you're a citizen, and your citizenship comes from your membership in this particular community. This seems, of course, to be at odds with the cosmopolitan conception that I don't owe you obligations just because you're a citizen in my community, but I owe you something because you're a human being as well. And these two things are in tension. Andrew Linklater nicely talks about the distinction between our standing as men, humans, and citizens, that we have this sort of bifurcated moral standing in contemporary world. We are both members of political communities, which grant us and enable us and can bring our rights into being, and membership of the species, community of humankind. And sometimes these things conflict. Sometimes what's good for my country might not be good for other people. So my goal is to try as much as possible to move towards resolution of this tension. One resolution of this tension has been the world state. We go in this increasing levels of universality from city to state to world state. A political realm moral on and embodying the cosmopolitan idea of equal moral standing, institutionalised in the format of some idea of a world state. Equal rules for everybody, laws that apply universally, everyone's subject to the same sovereign will, if you like. Another option has been, more recently, the idea of global constitutionalism, that we embed states in a global legal framework that requires them to uphold, conform to global cosmopolitan legal framework. And the key in that move, key issue is the source of the cosmopolitan morality comes from outside the state. Both these cases, the world government and the global constitution, the normative validity, the norms themselves are derived universally, and are then, the state has to conform to those universal moral principles. These are two approaches that I have some concern with, and I'm agnostic about all of them, in the sense that I don't want to take a principled position for or against, but I'm concerned about certain elements of both of them that I think are both analytically problematic, politically problematic, potentially damaging to the idea of cosmopolitan world order in some ways. And so I'm trying to find other ways to think about cosmopolitanism, and the particular agenda that I'm working on in this paper is the idea, how can we make the state more cosmopolitan, i.e. the individual state more cosmopolitan? Can we think of states themselves as being, if you like, less Westphalian and more cosmopolitan, more understanding themselves as, Henry Bull's words, local agents of a world of common good, which is distinct from seeing states as being subject to a higher authority, which is, I think, what most discussions of world government are about. When we think our sovereignty is at risk, that's what we're saying. Our authority is being threatened by an outside force, which might be global government, even if we've made that call. Anyway, so my goal then is to try to reconcile citizenship and humanity through more cosmopolitan refinements of the state. To do so, we have to first understand the relationship between cosmopolitanism and the state, and it's the idea of a social contract. The social contract is primarily concerned with, as goes to the room, what we owe to each other in our club. And social contract thinking, as someone mentioned earlier on, hasn't much thought about what does that mean for what we owe people outside the club. Do we have any obligations? In its most extreme form, that means no. We only have obligations to people in our club. Chris, you mentioned talking to Tanya Plibersek about not wanting to surrender sovereignty. That's one form of that expression, that this is our club, we're sovereign, we're in control, we don't want to give power to somebody else, and we don't have any obligations or many obligations to those people. Cosmopolitans, of course, argue, no, your membership in that community does not exclude your duties to outsiders. They may be different, but we still have obligations to outsiders as a member of being a member of that club. In particular, the argument goes that, and here I'm drawing the work of Thomas Pogge and Andrew Linklater, the argument goes that we may have different types of duties to outsiders than we have to insiders. Primarily, first and foremost, we have negative duties. We have duties not to harm outsiders. We can do whatever we want in our club, as long as whatever those club rules are, as long as being a member of that club doesn't involve negative costs, harms to outsiders. So we might not have extensive positive duties. We don't have to provide the solution to denial of rights in other countries. We don't have to provide the solution to poverty in other countries. But we at least shouldn't be contributing to those problems. We should not be exporting our harms. We should not be conducting our purposes so that they systematically harm outsiders. Now, of course, much of international law, as I understand it, I might be wrong, is in part about how do we manage that? How do we we have to go about our business. It's going to have impacts on outsiders. Let's find ways that we can go about our business in ways that we can all agree upon with a minimal, sometimes minimal levels, or acceptable levels of harm between each other. We sort of have to do that. But at the same time, there's very little substantive agreement about that. We do it all the time. States routinely harm other states and other political communities without thinking about it too much. We have some obvious examples in the case of aggressive war, unintended examples of climate change. One of the examples I like to think about, this will come in later in the paper, is the idea that we have a large body of international human rights law, international human rights treaties, most of which refers to states' obligations to uphold human rights domestically. Very little of which, some increasing, but some speak about the nature of whether a state has an obligation to uphold human rights abroad in its actions. And the absence of that creates quite a significant gap, especially when you're a big powerful state like the United States, who engages in practices of extraordinary rendition, or the use of drones, etc., in which you exercise your political power abroad in unaccountable ways, where you are not constrained to recognise the rights of outsiders in your actions. One crucial restriction on that way, however, is of course the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions, which are an example of some constraint upon state action. So, my concern in that context is how do we get the state to recognise its obligations and be constrained in its acts abroad by cosmopolitan global normative principles, in particular the harm principle. So I'm working in a very pragmatic sense. I want to find what I think is the sort of global basics that we're most likely to achieve agreement by most states. The idea that we ought not to harm each other, and not even by most states, by most people, is pretty basic. No one's gonna, it'd be pretty hard to not pass the universalizability test. No one's gonna say, no, it's okay for you to harm me all the time without my consent. Most people might say, well, I want to be able to harm you a little bit if I can, but no one's going to say, yeah, but you ought to be able to harm me. So chances are it's going to be higher, much more so than if we say everyone ought to be liberal Democrats. Everyone ought to be have a liberal democracy, and that's how we're going to solve the problem of poverty or peace or human rights. I think that's a very ambitious and, on one hand, of course, not a bad thing, but on the other hand, it contains lots of assumptions about the form of an acceptable universal moral community. So I'm much more interested in starting from real basics. What is the minimum we can get agreement upon? I think harm principle is one of those. So then the political, institutional task then is to think, how can we act on that? How can we bring that into being? And I take my leading part from, I'm going to stick with the Ipswich usage expression of Kant. How do we take, and I use the idea of the Pacific Federation of Kant's perpetual peace. Kant argued that we could secure his Pacific Federation, peace between states, between republican states, not democratic states, republican states, because of the nature of the domestic constitution. The Republican Constitution was one that embodied individual rights and restraint upon the government. The Republican Constitution is one that is restrained by law. It's one that sees the state as under the rule of law. Kant argued that Republican states were more predisposed towards a cosmopolitan federation because they weren't at war with their own populations, and some of the arguments that we've seen in the democratic peace thesis. The crucial part of this is that it was the Republican notion, not the democratic notion. So Kant recognised that states, especially Republican states, are bound by the rule of law, and they are a unique form in which individuals exercise autonomy and wherein a political community exercises self-determination and distinguishes itself from others. But he also identified, and that's an important part, I'm also in favour of high degrees of autonomy for political communities. Which he also argued that the Republican Constitution was a precondition to help bring a cosmopolitan world order into being. I think Kant's argument suggests that instead of seeking to reconstitute a global order, if you like, from above, in a way in which Republican, i.e. national, we might say national, but I think Republican political self-determination, autonomy, is disregarded. So in the case of global constitutionalism, the idea of the source of global cosmopolitan law is the global realm, which requires the overriding of the domestic realm, that is of the Republican account by a global account. I'm suggesting that a reconstitution of global order can or may be a necessary precondition of the reconstitution of many of the types of things we've been talking about here, can extend from transformation at the domestic constitutional level. Change in the global order extends from change in the domestic order. So in international relations speak, I'm using a second image analysis. I'm saying, contrary to people like Waltz, that actually if you change the nature of the states in such a way, you can potentially change the interactions between them and change the nature of the system itself. So, sorry. Kant argued that we can envisage then a global constitution that's a very minimal global constitution in which states basically contract out of the state of nature. They say voluntarily agree that they're going to surrender the right to wage war against each other and enter into a federation of states. And the European Union presents some evidence of this type of movement. The European Union has been probably the greatest experiment along these roads, down this road. And interestingly enough, part of the logic of the expression here was that it would set the example for the rest of them. It would not then go about coercing the rest of the world into joining the Pacific Federation, but simply by securing peace, people would say, oh, that looks good, we'd rather have peace than not peace, and we'll join and become. And very little was required. You didn't have to be a liberal democratic state, you just have to be a republican state in the sense that Kant meant. So, what is it about the republican state that's interesting? Well, the republican state is interested in the harm that is domination. Philip Pettit, recent Republican political theory, argues that the Republican idea of freedom is non-domination. The Republican state is concerned to limit its capacities to arbitrarily dominate or interfere with its citizens' own interests. So it's a big debate within Republican theory. Is it really republicanism or is it liberalism? Blah, blah, blah. Don't need to get involved in that debate. My idea, I want to bring out this notion of domination. Freedom, in this sense, is shared liberty as non-domination. It's freedom from domination, especially violence, and freedom also as a shared practice. We can only be free because we agree with each other to be free. The important part of being a non-dominating state is the old Republican idea that what touches all should be agreed by all. That you cannot be considered dominated if the rules that apply to you are the rules that you have agreed to. Presumably your agreement has not been coerced. And this translates into rule of law and some forms of representation and consent to law, what we think of as democracy in some way, some processes whereby people actually have the chance to consent or not consent to the rules, and the forms, the ways in which the rules are drawn up. So the constitutional republican state, crucially, is understood as having imposed restrictions upon its own capacity to dominate. So the rule of law suggests that the state itself is subject to law. So it goes against the sort of Schmittian idea that Alex was mentioning there, that a Republican, closer to what Dan was saying, the Republican state is one that says, actually we don't have the capacity to set the exemption anymore, that we are subject to the law as well, that the state can also be bound by the law. And the job of the Constitution is to set that out. However, as we've seen, A correlate of Republican theory has been an emphasis on the Republican state as a guarantor of the rights of citizens only. It hasn't extended that capacity for non-domination to outsiders, so it coheres with some social contract theory in some way. Now, there have recently been some attempts to think that through more or less. Okay, so, sorry, through these parts. The danger, from the Republican theory, the danger of global, the world state or the global constitutional realm is that the source, if the source of legislation governing the citizens comes from outside, then they are being dominated, whether it be by another individual state or by an institutional form beyond their own state. They've not consented to be part of that process. So especially in the current international legal discussions about a global cosmopolitan constitution, it very much suggests that citizens of states are subject to a law which has its origins outside the state and therefore are dominated by those laws. Clearly, the case for global democracy is a case to make laws that we are not dominated by, that we persist and have a contribution to. How much time have I got, Lou?
Till a quarter till, perhaps?
Okay, great. Okay. So, what does the Constitution do? Part of the Republican state, the core idea is that the idea of non-domination is expressed through having a state that is restrained by a constitution. The Constitution plays two roles. Constitutes, it brings into being a political organisation through setting out and defining its rules and its structures, but it also shows the limits of that state. So Sartori called this the guaranteist function of the cosmopolitan, to set limits on a state's capacity to harm its own citizens, to arbitrarily imprison them, to arbitrarily deny them of rights, to act without oversight, etc., etc. So according to James Bowman, Republican states therefore have self-limiting constitutions that guarantee the rights and legal standing of their citizens and which constrain the state's capacity for domination by subjecting it to the rule of law. According to Bowman, the rule of law is not merely instrumental to bringing about some form of freedom, but is in part constitutive of it as political freedom, status that can be had in no other way than through the laws shared by a community. Non-domination is achieved not through threats or coercion, but by introducing constitutional authority that is so organised that it cannot itself become the dominator. So, insofar as domestic constitutions are not constrained in their actions, relations to outsiders, and even Republican states who have constitutional limits on their power can engage in domination abroad. Because their constitutions are not structured in such a way that they limit what the state can do. Also, of course, you have the problem, how do people who are not members of the community consent to laws that may affect them? That's a problem for Republican political theory, a democratic boundary problem. Republicans see the rule of law as constitutively as establishing a condition in which everyone has at least one fundamental status, the status of being a citizen. Republican constitutions also include measures to assure the accountability of the state to its populace, as I've said. This might include means for legal redress for harms committed by the state, as well as mechanisms for guaranteeing the state will uphold its positive duties to its populations. All these things work to ensure that states cannot, arbitrarily, without judicial accountability, override the rights of their citizens. However, traditionally, extraterritorial affairs would be on the jurisdiction of the state and its citizens, and by definition, outsiders were not party to the contract. My argument is simply that one way to proceed at this juncture, this particular historical juncture we have, towards cosmopolitan international order, is to make the state more cosmopolitan itself, to make the domestic social contract inclusive of the considerations of outsiders, to write into the domestic constitution, for instance, the applicability of rule of law in relation to states' actions beyond its boundaries. There's been some great case history in the United States. It's particularly complex on this matter because of the nature of the US Bill of Rights and its problems in relation to the state's capacity to wage foreign policy, to use wage foreign policy. In the US, there's been a long debate about whether Fifth Amendment rights and others apply to international politics, to foreign policy of the state. There's also been a judicial practice of saying we can't blur the judicial, excuse me, my terminology, US terminology's gone out my head, the executive from the legislature, from the judiciary. So, and the executive has the capacity to make foreign policy. The judiciary doesn't, therefore the judiciary cannot rule upon the actions of the state abroad, because that would be unconstitutional. So the judiciary cannot say that a government has or has not violated Fifth Amendment status of a non-citizen, because those non-citizens don't have Fifth Amendment status, because the US Constitution does not apply to actions abroad. Now, this is not a simple, clear-cut resolution. This is a debate that goes on continuously in the US courts, and sometimes different judges come more down one way than another. But it underlies things like Guantanamo. How do we have Guantanamo? In part because the US doesn't have to recognise the rights of non-citizens who it detains abroad, because they're not citizens. So, most extant constitutions do not impose the same restrictions upon their state and their citizens abroad as they do domestically, because this is seen as potentially a violation of other sovereignty, or simply where the jurisdictional authority ends at the border. I'm especially concerned with making foreign policy justiciable, that is subject to rule of law requirements, restricting states' freedom of action in the international realm along cosmopolitan lines, particularly along ideas of human rights, I think are particularly pertinent here. So I think it follows that a cosmopolitan national constitution should extend the guarantees provision to outsiders. It should accept restrictions on its rights to inflict arbitrary harm, and that it should include legal recognition of the rights of outsiders, including the extension of the rule of law to foreign policy. In other words, a republican state is required to fashion a way to ensure its non-domination of other states and individuals beyond its borders, to write the form of non-domination in relation to those beyond its borders into its constitution. So I'm talking about we reform the domestic constitution with clauses that write explicitly beyond, we agreed to the international law of treaties, that says we have rights to individuals beyond our borders, not just to other states, but individuals with duties not to harm them in certain ways, to be accountable at least for what we do. In this way, we recognise outsiders' status as persons, like moral persons, as humans, without necessarily granting them full rights of citizenship and belonging. And I think I'll end with one brief example of how I think this can be done, or as a model for developments along future lines, in particular human rights. And there's a growing body of international legal commentary that suggests that extraterritorial responsibilities do fall upon states in certain human rights, international human rights treaties. But if we think about I'm thinking of a non-human rights issue, but one that's, well, it is a human rights issue. Anyway, in Australia and some other countries, we currently have laws on the books that prevent people travelling abroad to engage in practices of underage sex. Laws that are crime that is considered a crime domestically within Australia. You go abroad, you commit that crime, you come back, you can still be prosecuted for something you did overseas. So the state has said we have extraterritorial jurisdiction over our citizens in another territory in certain matters. So this is an extension of, not of sovereignty, but of sovereignty as a right to rule your citizens, but without inflicting upon the sovereignty of another state. It does not impact in any negative way upon the sovereignty of the other state that we assert that right of sovereignty over others. Actually carrying out the jurisdiction abroad is tricky, and you need cooperation and such. But this is even though it occurs under the auspices of a UN treaty, a UN agreement on the rights of child trafficking, in principle, such a rule could extend to any similar sort of rule, law on the books, criminal law. You could say if you commit a murder in Japan, you come back to Australia, we'll try you for that murder here if we can prove it. It doesn't have to be governed by an international human rights treaty. So that, I think, is the model for how we can constitutionalise human rights laws that would require the state to not only recognise the human rights of its own citizens, but restrict its actions to citizens abroad and the actions of its own citizens when they go abroad.